Chess's most fearless attacker has the black pieces today, and a quieter master, Platonov, is about to beat the great Tal at his own game. Platonov opens with the king's pawn to e4, planting a flag in the center. Tal replies with the Sicilian, a pawn to c5. He wants to fight, not a handshake. Next, the knight develops to f3, preparing to strike at the heart of the board. Black settles into the Najorf, a pawn to d6 covering the east 5 square. Now white breaks, open the position, the pawn jumping to d4. In comes the trade on d4, and the c-file swings open for the second player. White's knight recaptures on d4, centered and full of quiet menace. The reply is a knight to f6, immediately leaning on the e4 pawn. Up steps a second knight to c3, guarding e4 without any fuss. Here's the Najorf signature, a modest pawn to a6, denying white the b5 square. Outswings the bishop to c4, a pointed, aggressive choice aimed squarely at f7. Calmly, black answers with a pawn to e6, shoring up f7 in the middle. Safety first for white, who castles the king snugly into the corner. Black's bishop steps to e7, modest but perfectly solid. Retreating a touch, the bishop slides to b3, keeping its eye on the king's side. Tal grabs space on the queen's side, a pawn to b5 nudging at white's bishop. Watch the f-pawn march to f4. Platonov wants to roll forward and attack. Quietly, the second bishop comes to b7, aiming down the long diagonal at white's king. Pushes the pawn to f5, cramping black and daring him to respond. Black slams the door with a pawn to e5, freezing the center and seizing d4. Backsteps the knight to e2, rerouting toward friendlier squares. Developing the last piece, Tal's knight settles on d7. Pressure lands on f6 as the bishop swings out to g5. Tal lifts a rook to c8, lining it up on a half-open file. Then white trades it off, the bishop taking the knight on f6. Black recaptures with the other knight on f6, structure untouched. White's queen steps to d3, linking the rooks and watching the king's side. Notice the rook swinging up to c5. Tal wants it active and irritating. Platonov plants the knight on d5, a gorgeous central outpost. Tal removes it at once, the bishop capturing on d5. Recapturing cleanly, the bishop lands on d5 and surveys the whole board. Finally, black castles, the king finding shelter in the corner. A quiet pawn to c3 steadies the center and readies white's expansion. Tal's queen swings out to b6, pointing toward the king's side. Tucking the king to h1, white calmly sidesteps any tricks on the diagonal. Even Tal slips here, the pawn to b4, when his knight could simply capture on d5 and keep things level. Immediately, white clamps down, the pawn to c4, freezing black's queen side. Undeterred, black rolls a pawn to a5, gaining ground on the flank. White answers with a pawn to b3, holding the c4 point firmly. Forward goes the a-pawn to a4, Tal knocking on white's door. Repositioning, the knight reaches g3, drifting toward the king's side. Black's rook glides over to a5, ready to switch sides. Queen to f3, Platonov gathers his pieces near the enemy king. Lurking on the long diagonal, Tal's queen settles on a7. Both rooks in play now. White brings the last one to d1. Tal cracks the queen side open, the pawn capturing on b3. Recapture on b3, and white's pawns stay connected. Suddenly, the rook plunges to a2, biting into white's second rank. Unfazed, white springs the knight to h5, pressing toward the king. Reinforcing the attack, black's other rook comes to c8. Knight takes on f6 with check, and at once the position sharpens. Forced, Tal recaptures with the bishop on f6. Platonov's queen lands on h5, breathing down on the king's side. Defending the 7th rank, black drops a rook to c7, bringing more force toward the king. White lifts the rook to f3. Doubling on the 2nd rank, Tal crashes the other rook to c2. Both rooks now deep in white's position. Platonov calmly meets it, doubling his rooks with the other coming to f1. Pulling back to a2, Tal keeps the rook deep and dangerous. Making room for his king, white nudges the pawn to h3, in no hurry at all. Centralizing, Tal's queen jumps to c5, eyeing the weak points in white's camp. Back swings a rook to d3, Platonov patiently improving and waiting for his moment. Black regroups, sliding a rook to a7 behind the front line. White's king strolls to h2, unhurried and untouchable. A small pawn to h6 gives Tal's king a breath of air. Platonov's rook drifts to g3, hovering near the king's side. The king edges toward f8, hunting a calmer square. Notice the rook gliding back to d3. Platonov is content to wait. Probing again, Tal lifts the rook to a5. Again, the rook returns to g3, the two sides circling each other. Down to a2 it slides once more, black keeping the tension alive. Unhurried, the rook glides back to d3, composure unshaken. Switching files, Tal brings a rook to c7. Once more the rook shifts to g3, the tension stretched almost to breaking. Pressing harder, Tal pushes the rook to a3 against the b3 pawn. Here it is, Platonov throws the rook to g6. Retreating was safer, but he's hunting the king. The pawn snaps up a rook on g6. Tal takes the bait. But back comes the recapture on g6, and that little pawn is a dagger beside black's king. Desperate for counterplay, the queen darts t3. Platonov repositions the queen to f5, coolly eyeing the squares around the king. And here Tal cracks. The king steps to e8, straight into the storm. Defending with the queen to e2 was the only way to fight on. Instantly, Platonov pounces, the queen swinging to e6 with check. Tal's king flees to d8, but there's no shelter left. The hammer falls, queen to g8 with check. The g6 pawn is about to crown, and Platonov has out-attacked the greatest attacker who ever lived.